Hi.
Reem, just to let you know. Do you have 2 minutes? I'll, I'll hold this one. Okay, so we're clear on the order. Hi. I want you to meet Sarah. بعد ما نخلص you should meet. Okay. اسمع. بعد ما تخلص I want you guys to have it. exactly فبعد يعني الناس بتوعنا اللي هم مش شايفاهم كتير من الناس اللي بيجني بقى المشكلة كل يعني ممكن مثلا الناس المهمة start second
You should never mention the 90s as a point of reference in our.
Dawa is actually, thank you. What's the English word for dawa?
Well, in religious terms, it's proselytizing.
Anti-astic, sorry, anti-astic. I've got the dawa on that again.
Invitation.
Oh, proselytization. Proselytizing.
Invitation out proselytizing.
Right. Okay. Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start by apologizing for this. Like everyone else, I will be very glad to see the back of winter. So, apologies. Thank you for joining us for what we hope is going to be a very interesting panel. My name is Mirette Mabrouk. I am the Deputy Director of the Hariri Center. And today we're going to have a bit of a discussion on elections and the electorate. Now, elections on their own are a significant part of the democratic process, but as one of our panelists will tell you afterwards, they're only a part of the democratic process. But in countries that are new to the democratic process or are tentative about it, they tend to take on an occasionally exaggerated importance. This is absolutely the case in Egypt, where Egyptians have gone to the polls no less than 8 times since the uprising in 2011. We were supposed to be going to the polls again a few days ago, but thanks to a ruling by a committee from the Supreme Constitutional Court, which knocked down the constitutionality of parts of the electoral law, the elections have been delayed. We don't know how long. So the question is really, how important are the elections? Who's voting? What role do elections actually play in political participation? How much political participation is there? And when people head for the polls, who's voting? Who isn't voting? What do political parties know about their constituencies? How are they going to try and rope in all those laggards on the end who are either apathetic or disencouraged or disincentivized, or have chosen to display their political participation in means outside the ballot box? So we're very lucky with our panel today. On the screen behind me, coming in from Cairo, is Reem Awny Abu-Zaid. And Reem is actually the project manager who manages the Egypt elections project at the Danish-Egyptian at the Danish-Egyptian Dialogue Institute. Reem is a lawyer, and her specialization actually is elections and voting behavior. So we're very lucky to have her, and she will be speaking to us on the political setup in Egypt at the moment, the political scene in Egypt, why the elections may be important to political participation afterwards, and what kind of parliament we might wind up with. On my left, speaking second, is Sahar Aziz. Sahar is a board member of the Egyptian American Right to Law Association. She is an associate professor at Texas University, and she has written extensively about the judiciary in Egypt. On my right is Hariri Center non-resident fellow Sahar Sirgany. Sahar Sirgany is a well-known journalist. She was named one of the 13 female journalists to watch last year by Arabiya. She is going to be speaking about her upcoming issue brief entitled To Vote or Not to Vote on Egypt's Diverse Electorate. And she will be talking about the question that we raised at the end: who's voting, who isn't voting, who can be persuaded to, and why they're not doing it, and what this means for the future political participation in Egypt. So thank you very much, and we're going to start with Reem.
Thank you, Mirette. Thank you for this opportunity, though I think debunking the whole political reality in Egypt is really hard now. The whole situation is really complex, and the development on the regional front basically is adding to its complexity. But addressing the issue, I thought of talking about three main points. The first is the political will. The second is what is the government is actually doing in the absence of the parliament. And the last point is probably political parties and the upcoming parliament. In concern of the political will, I was actually playing with the idea whether actually there is a political will to have a parliamentary election in Egypt sometime soon or not. And I can see the current government is dealing with the issue on a strategic laid-back approach rather than crisis management. So for the current government, I won't claim that they see the delay or the effective stop of the elections as a crisis at all. Basically, I rest my argument on an internal factor and an international factor. On the internal level, I can see other processes that is being speeded up to meet the current needs. Yani, for instance, there's a lot of legislations that were issued right before the economic summit just for the purpose of attracting investors, because apparently economy is placed high on the priority list of the current government. Comparing that to the parliamentary elections, I think they are dealing with it in a more relaxed manner. In that sense, I want to talk about the international pressure. International pressure that is being applied on the current Egyptian government at the moment to have elections. I honestly don't think so. The whole myth behind the myth of international pressure for democratization is no longer valid in the Egyptian reality. I think, aside of some statements from the European Union or the White House, there's no effective pressure applied from the international community on the current government in Egypt to hold elections at all. I think the current government reliance on the Saudi Arabia and the Emirates for funds and economic support has been adding a lot to the hesitance of the current government to hold elections anytime soon. So I don't want to be really suspicious, but let's test what is happening during the absence of the parliament. From my opinion, I can see that there is a hyper legislative process taking place in Egypt. We have laws that is being ratified overnight in Egypt. But again, it's all really related to the economy and the social factor of our society. So it's not that purely directly political. But on the political level, I want to test the whole process of stopping elections rather than delaying elections, and whether that's going to be proceeding sometime soon. So actually examining that, I can see some positive points. I can see that right after the verdict issued by the Supreme Constitutional Court, the president issued a clear order for the government to amend the two laws controlling the process within a month. And actually, today is the deadline for that. The President Sisi issued that a month ago, and today is the deadline that the government was supposed to submit a draft of two amended versions of the laws. But I can see also on the bright side that there's been a movement towards redrafting the laws rather than amending, and this redrafting process is including different political actors. So now we finally can see that political parties are being involved. Political parties submitted a proposal to the Higher Election Commission and to the government 10 days ago, with a proposal to increase the number of individual seats as well as the number of seats assigned for the party lists. Although one of the government officials announced that these proposals are really unconstitutional, yet the Prime Minister decided to have a sit and talk with the political parties, but with no promises, this Thursday. So it's really important to notify that the political parties are getting involved in the process, and that's the first time actually to involve them. But whether civil society is going to be involved or international organizations, I don't think that's going to happen. So we're not involving international expertise within the process. We're only relying on the government to issue the two laws and the political parties to propose ideas. So speculations for the coming elections, I think the most optimistic speculation was that elections will take place in September. And I can see that possible or feasible by anyway. I think that logistically, after Ramadan and Eid and then Eid, then elections might take place the earliest in November, if not December, if not after. So we can easily expect elections to take place early next year, not this year. So political parties, and that's my last point I want to talk about, political parties and the coming parliament. I don't want to just keep on saying that the last law marginalized the role of political parties to a great extent. 20% of the parliament is comparatively nothing to what the political parties deserve after 4 years of hyper political agenda. The political parties were marginalized, ignored during the drafting of the previous law. I'm not sure if they are going to go forward with increasing the seats allowed for political parties or not in the coming parliament. But even if that is allowed, I can see that the political party structure are really, really weak. They don't have a platform. They don't have an ideological discourse. They don't have popular support. And when I say that, I can generalize, actually. Unfortunately, I can. The most supported political parties in Egypt, such as parties of the Democratic Front, like the Constitution Party or the Free Egyptian Party, or even the Strong Egypt Party, which is a moderate Islamic party, I can't classify them as a popular parties khalis. I can't say that. And that was really obvious during the party list drafting process, party list formulation process. And for instance, the Egypt Awakening party list the formulation was really a nightmare because everyone was talking about the chaos and how parties submitted their candidacy and what was the criteria. No one knows what was the criteria in picking the candidates and not others. So I can say in a generalized form, but maybe I don't want to be so generic, but it's in a general form that political parties in Egypt are not that strong. Is there a possibility for the formulation of a national political party? I would say there is a glimpse of a possibility that there is a party called the Future of Egypt that could be a national popular party, not in the fashion of the former NDP, but in the fashion of state supporter political party. So maybe that would be a window of opportunity for them to vent out in the political process due to the delay of the elections, whether they are going to run for the coming election or not. They already announced that they are going to run for the coming elections, but are they going to gain majority? That would be the question. So the coming I can't predict the shape of the coming parliament, honestly, because I don't see the law in hand. I can't say that parties would be represented fairly in the coming parliament or not, but I can say that there are tendencies, there are trials from different political forces to form a national party, a collection of political actors that could run on a state supporting a political list, a party list, and eventually make it to the parliament. And that's it.
Reem, thank you so much. Right on time. Before I turn over to Sahar, I have a quick question for you. Now, you've pointed out that political parties in Egypt are not strong. They have weak platforms. They're not ideologically convincing. It's been 4 years. Why do you think Egypt's political parties still don't have their act together?
Honestly, يعني working with political parties, I really don't want to be that. I don't want to judgment that harshly because the newly established political parties witnessed a lot during the past 4 years. 4 years is not a long period of time in the age of political institutions. It take political parties 20 and 30 years to be established in a correct manner. The point here is that it's not only 4 years, it's 4 years, 8 electoral processes, different governments, and a hyper political agenda, not only on the level of political processes, but also on the different waves of political popular discontent. So if you collect the elements of social unrest, political conflict, different governments, and continuous changes in the government, I can see that that's not a healthy environment for any political party to be established. I would just judge political parties 10 years from now, after a parliament is already formed, elected, and formed, and re-elected, maybe, and then we can discuss whether political parties are weak or not. But up till now, I can't judge them as a political institution. They are still acting as if they are informal organizations rather than formal organizations. For their values and political ideas to be institutionalized, that needs some time. So, and that needs some time and stability, actually, on the political front. So as soon as stability is there, as soon as they are integrated in the political process, then we can judge political parties. Because political parties are suffering from the lack of membership, lack of funding, and they are all personalized. They are all centered around one candidate, like Abdelmanan Futuh, Baradei, and other figures. So it's still not an institution, but rather a movement that is going behind one figure.
All right. Okay.
So I think judging them would require us to take a step backward and wait for a while.
Okay, very wise. All right. Thank you, Reem. We're going to move over to Sahar.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mirette, and your team for inviting me. This is definitely a very important issue for Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries. So I want to make 3 main points, and then I'll go into some detail about them. First, free and fair elections are only one component among many of a democratic political system. So we shouldn't inflate their importance, though we shouldn't discount them either. Second, law is only as relevant as it is legitimate before the citizens to which it applies. And we also, so therefore, we want to be careful not to fall into a law fetish, which we in the United States tend to have, and that is usually not the case in the Middle East, where law is used as a tool to perpetuate authoritarianism as opposed to uphold democracy. And finally, that being said, my tentative assessment of Egypt's election laws after 2011, and they've gone through various iterations, is that there is a slow but painful process through trial and error that the election laws are becoming more, they facilitate a democratic process more so than the past. And I make that as a very tentative conclusion. And for those who want more details, I have a piece in the George Washington International Law Review that goes into doctrinal analysis of the legal doctrine. Okay, so the first point about free and fair elections is only one component. So there are 7 components of a democracy that it tends to be very commonly cited in the political science literature. The first, government decisions are made by elected officials. Free, fair, and frequent elections are held for selecting those government officials. Adult suffrage, adults have the right to run for office, access to alternative sources of information, freedom of expression, and freedom of association. So when you're thinking of democracy, those are some of the fundamental components. And then when you're looking at elections in particular, you need to be looking at what is the centrality of free and fair elections in any democratic polity, the role of electoral competition in institutionalizing agreement between political players on the rules of the political game. So to the extent that elections are not establishing the rules of the political game, then they don't become relevant. And then the possibility of voting authoritarian parties out of office through elections. And again, to the extent you cannot do that, then elections become less relevant. And then finally, the relationship between elections and social democratization, which I think is the biggest issue for Egyptians moving forward. The good news is there have been multiple, 8 to be specific, elections that have been relatively free and fair. Now, in various political contexts, it can be more or less coercive depending on which election you're looking at in the last 4 years. But the point is they're certainly better in a substantive sense than they were during Mubarak's years. But you still need to see the social democratization within the culture, which is a process in the works. And then finally, to conclude that an election is free and fair, there are 3 factors that you should look at. One, that there is ex ante uncertainty. You do not know who is going to win beforehand. Second, ex post irreversibility. You cannot reverse the outcome because you don't like who won. And third, it's repeatable. It's not one vote, one time, forever. Okay, so those are the types of things we need to be looking at when analyzing whether it's good law or bad law for purposes of promoting democracy. The second point is law is only as relevant as it is legitimate in the eyes of the citizenry. Now, in contrast to Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, rule of law actually was a part of the discourse, a part of the political culture. However, it was co-opted under very thin notions of rule of law, meaning that you use law for, you relied on the procedural aspects of law and not the substantive aspects of law. So rule of law is relevant in Egypt, but it is manipulated as well. And we're not talking about a Libya under Gaddafi, which is, a good thing, not a perfect thing. And so, as a result, you've got this culture of authoritarianism that was guised under rule of law through these election processes, among other processes, that has bred distrust and low political literacy among Egyptians. And the good news is the last 4 years has increased that political literacy, but 4 years is a very short period of time. I agree with Reem. And so we're still looking to see, have elections advanced societal democratization? So now I'll get to my third point, which I'll focus on, which is the election laws themselves and the provisions. And again, I can't go into a lot of detail due to time, but there were 3 laws that were at issue: the political rights law, the parliamentary elections law, and the elections constituency law. The law, the second one, which was regarding the parliamentary elections, it essentially mandated that there would be 567 members for the House of Representatives, Majlis al-Shab. There is no more Shura Council. It has been banned or eliminated, which is, I think, a positive development because the Shura Council had no legislative authority and it was effectively a tool of the executive branch to interfere in legislative affairs. It was really more of an advisory, coercive mechanism. So 567 members, of whom 420 are reserved for independent candidates, 120 are filled through party seats, or party lists, and 27 are appointed by the president. The Constitution limits the presidential appointments to 5%. So that's 27. So whatever the number in the House of Representatives, only up to 5% can be appointed by the president. And usually those appointments are made to women, Copts, maybe now youth post-uprising, but they tended to be used for underrepresented minorities with the caveat they were always loyalists. So oftentimes these underrepresented minority groups would be tokenized through these appointments. And I say that because those in the US who tend to be very formalistic about we just need X number of women, or we need X number of Copts, or we need X number of youth, dig beneath the surface and find out whether those individuals are in fact representing their constituency or whether they're being co-opted and tokenized to perpetuate the status quo against the interests of the constituency that they're supposed to be representing. Okay, so then there was a big dispute over these 420 independent seats. There are 27 governorates in Egypt, according to at least for purposes of these laws. And within those 27 governorates, there's 231 districts. The problem that the Supreme Court found was that of these 231 districts, there were 3 categories. 35 of the districts had 3 seats. 119 districts had 2 seats, 77 districts had 1 seat. And when the court asked the government why does this have 1 and why does this have 3 and why does this have 2, there was no acceptable explanation. It was not based on population. It was not based on any criteria that the court found was acceptable to be in compliance with Article 102 of the 2014 Constitution, which mandates that there must be fair representation and fair political rights of all voters. So it essentially gave some districts more representation than other districts in a way that didn't make sense to the court. And that was the primary basis for striking down that provision of the elections constituency law. The other problem that was at stake was some of the districts were larger than other districts and not necessarily reflective of population differences. And from an individual candidate's perspective, it's much more expensive and much more time-consuming to have to campaign, you're an independent candidate, in a large region as opposed to a small region. So again, that would burden, that created unfair competition. So the court held that while the population distribution among the districts doesn't have to be equal, they said it should be about 168,000 per district population-wise, there should be no more than a 25% disparity in population difference for those who have the same number of seats. So that was something to kind of give back to the government or this committee. It's an 11-member committee now that is working on this in redrafting the law. The other issue that came up was the dual citizenship of those who want to run for office. So the law permitted people like myself, so I was born in Cairo, which essentially gives me de facto Egyptian citizenship if I wanted to invoke it, and I could go and run for office as a member of the diaspora. And the law prohibited me from doing that, the election law. And the court found that that was unconstitutional, that I should be able to run for office. And the legal basis was in Article 141 and Article 164, respectively, it prohibits the presidency, anyone running for presidency or prime minister, to have dual citizenship. And in Article 164, it talks about anyone who wants to run for government, which is the same provision for the prime minister. It explicitly, or it's very obvious that for prime minister, it prohibits dual citizenship. But for anyone else, it does not. So if you're reading it literally as a Supreme Court justice, you're going to argue, look, if that's what you wanted, you should have put it in the Constitution. And what you're doing is you're effectively legislating into the Constitution a prohibition that's not there. So it's a wink and a nod and say, go amend your Constitution if you don't like it. From a political perspective, I think the reason why that was well, to the extent one thinks that there's a judicialization of politics, which I think there is, the court or the executive branch may have found that it's more attractive to have the diaspora involved in government and that they want the diaspora involved so that there would be more investment and more involvement in the country because there's quite a bit of wealth outside the United States, outside Egypt. And sorry, there's one other issue, which is non-resident Egyptians who have one citizenship, Egyptian citizenship, can also run for office. So that was another contradiction, is why would you let them run for office? So an Egyptian in Saudi Arabia who only has Egyptian citizenship could run, but an Egyptian American could not run, or Egyptian Brit could not run. Okay, and I will end there, and through the Q&A, I'd be happy to highlight what I think have been further advancements and then further regression in this kind of procession of improvement, very slow and painful, of election laws towards democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Before we move on, Sarah, I have a very, very quick question. So in your opinion, do you see any other objections coming down the turnpike?
Yeah, there are a few. The first is, to the extent, so if you all remember in 2012, when the Supreme Constitutional Court dissolved the parliament that was dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood Freedom and Justice Party, the basis for the dissolution, one of the bases among many, was that it created unfair representation. You had 1/3 individual candidates and 2/3 party candidates, and then you had the party candidates running for the independent seats. So that essentially was one of the bases for finding that it was the law or that provision was unconstitutional. So begs the question of having 2/3 of the seats for individuals and only 1/3 for party lists. Does that potentially create the same problem but in reverse? So that's something we might want to keep track of. The other is that in this law, which I think is an improvement and a response to this dissolution 2012, you cannot switch political parties after you obtain an independent seat. So you cannot, X party cannot essentially game the system and run independents, and then they come back and they're part of the party list. Now, interestingly, there is a provision or there has been reports or concerns that this applies only to male candidates and potentially not to female candidates. And so that's something to look into. I need to look into it more, but I have read some reports that there may be some discrepancy in terms of who can and who cannot switch parties. So to the extent that there is, and the quotas as well might come up, by the way, because one thing that is interesting about this system is the 120 seats that are party lists, it's a party block list, which means it's an all or nothing, and there are 4 districts, and 2 of them are 15 seats, and 2 of them are 45 seats, to a total of 120, and it's all or nothing. And within those party lists, there are very clear quotas for women, youth, individuals with disabilities, farmers, and workers. To the extent that there is very few seats left for what the party, whoever the party wants to nominate for those seats. So I can see that also becoming a point of contention for kind of equal opportunity to access political office.
Right, thank you very much. We're now going to move to Sarah, who's going to take a look at not so much the legalities and the logistics, which we've just had a rundown on, but Sarah, when through her work and when she was working on the issue brief, dug very, very deeply into who our voters were, who was voting, who wasn't voting, why weren't they voting, and how parties could try and bring them around or co-opt them, as it were, and what this meant for political participation in the country. So I'm going to move over to Sarah.
Okay. So it's if you want to measure the disenfranchised voters or the disenfranchised electorate in Egypt, it's very difficult. We have numbers, we have indicators, but we don't have regular statistics that could measure that. We could go back to the turnout of 2013 elections. We have the constitutional referendum, which had 38% turnout, and then we had the presidential elections in May, which had 47.4% turnout. We in past elections and past votes that were dismissed or they also had over 50% of voters that were not interested in the process at all. Of course, we cannot confuse this apathy with people that would vote and had usually voted or be interested in the election process and are intentionally boycotting the elections. But this is what we're stuck with. We have different sectors of the society right now that either are divided. We can look at them in 2 ways. We can look at them through the parties, or we can look at them through the voters, the potential voters. Some potential voters that would be interested in the election process might not find the candidates that they would vote for, and there are parties or political movements that are not necessarily driving up the vote, are not selling the case. And we can look at them and divide them into 3 parts, or 2.5, or... So let's start with the Islamists. We have the Muslim Brotherhood, who have won the elections prior to 2013, different votes, but they lost faith. Some of their members lost faith in the process because basically they were winning and they were ousted. And in addition to the loss of popular support for Islamists that we have seen in the June 30 protests against Muslim Brotherhood. And in addition to this, we have what happened in 2013. I think everyone here is familiar with what happened. There was a brutal and deadly crackdown on supporters of ousted President Mohamed Morsi. And the peak of it was on August 13, 2013, when we saw over 1,000 people killed, the majority of whom were in the span of a few hours in one square, basically, in Cairo. And that created a cycle of violence that I'll discuss later on. But this has created in itself a moral dilemma for the members, and a moral obstacle that they see this as the Muslim Brotherhood-led anti-coup coalition calls it blood elections. They see any sort of participation as legitimizing the process because if you look at any of their statements, any official statements, Mohamed Morsi is still, for them, is still the legitimate president. Anything else that would legitimize the process would basically undermine their raison d'etre. And so it's very, as some of the members would tell me, it's very costly for their leaders, whether they are inside the Egypt or in exile, to tell them, let's vote, let's go into elections. That would undermine everything they've been saying over the past 18 months. In addition to, like, we can also, we can argue about the strength of the structure of the Muslim Brotherhood and whether they can pass through their network, that's very strong network, pass difficult or challenging ideas that could undermine the structure even more. If you see, like, a lot of their leaders and their rank and file are in prison in what can be numbered in thousands of people. And on the others, not totally on the other side, but close to them are their Salafi, the ultra-conservative Muslims that have at some point been allies to the Muslim Brotherhood, and in some other other cases, they've been their main competitor when it comes to the conservative voter base in Egypt. So long before 2013 happened, this base have been fragmented. It's not as unified as we thought it was in 2011 elections, when the Salafi alliance of three political parties led by Al-Noor party won about 25% of the vote in the 2011 parliamentary elections. But even Al-Noor party sees that it cannot come close to drumming up the same support or getting the same numbers it got in 2011. In 2013, its founder established another party. Its scholars have been disagreeing on a number of issues. One of them is this came later on in 2013 after Mohamed Morsi was ousted from power, where do we stand? Do we support the Muslim Brotherhood, or do we support the Noor party stance, which has been pro-military? And we've seen over the past 18 months a lot of scholars that have found followers discussing or revisiting the issue whether political participation is compatible with Islam and the da'wah and their religious efforts in general. And this has found support, more or less. And then if we move, so when I talk to members of Al-Noor party who are participating in the elections, who have voiced support for the military, they tell me they understand that they have lost credibility with some of their base, their older base, who see them as on the wrong side of what they see as a war on Islam. They support the military. They don't support the Islamist protesters or Islamist constituency in Egypt. And thus far, they've scaled down their projections for the elections and now target the more pious citizens who would rather vote for someone on the Islamist side, someone who are pious but not without any sort of political affiliation, or they don't have a political background to judge candidates accordingly. And if we move on to the non-Islamists, the leftists, the liberal, the secular, regardless of how we want to call them, it's a different story. They didn't, in the summer, over the past summer, at the end of the summer, there were a lot of these parties that had a stake in the post-June 30 governments that were leading the case for political participation. They seem to be winning an argument within themselves about the boycott. There have been voices since before 2011 that see participation in political participation in the form of elections as contradictory with the revolutionary path. The democratization in their eyes would not go through is contradictory to elections in that context. And if you look at 2013, 2014, these reasons are very much augmented. The political space is closing down. Freedoms, the crackdown on freedoms is much worse. Thousands of their colleagues and activists are behind bars. Yes, the crackdown is not as bad or not as deadly as it has been on the Islamists, but they have more issues. And even you can see this in the monitoring, in the European Union election observation mission, in the report about elections in 2013, and how the political context itself was presented a challenge to the election and undermined it in a bit. In a way, even though the process itself, the voting, the ballot counting was more or less free and fair. But Yet, over the summer, for some reason, the parties managed to convince, or appeared like they were convincing their younger members, their constituency, that elections could yield to something. I had members argue to me that even though they did not, they know that they would not get the results they would hope for, they still saw in the elections, they saw their absence in the next 4 years from parliament as a problem that would, as an existential problem, that would basically take them out of the equation completely. And up to January 23rd, 2015, I was out with a member from the Freedom and Liberty Party, which is it's a new party. It still hasn't fully registered yet. And we were out campaigning in a low-income neighborhood in Cairo. And he told me that even though he wasn't that interested in elections in general, but he was convinced that he had to make that step. He wanted to put his foot in the process to allow for the younger members to give them the time to organize and to revisit their strategies while they are in the process. 2 weeks later, he was out. He said, "I can't." And by that time, a lot of the political parties on that side had announced their boycott, because on January 24, we had the killing of Shayma El-Sabah. She was basically in a march, not even a protest, commemorating the martyrs of 2011, and she was killed by a bird shot. By pair-shot pellets, shot by the police, according to the prosecutor. From a very short distance. I don't know, we can argue about why Shayma and not any of the thousands, hundreds before her that created this debate within Egypt. It could be the iconic image of her colleague carrying her with the policeman in the background. But it shook something, and it just helped the voice within those secular and leftist parties to win. That called for boycotting. I called the same Freedom and Liberty Party member, and I asked him if he's running. He said, "I can't. I can't. I'll be running over blood. I can't do it." This has confirmed what we've been talking about for so long time. And I talked to other people that basically reiterated this. They can't run, and parties accordingly have boycotted. And you can see that some of these parties we can discuss, like the Dastoor political party, who has Al-Tayar al-Shabi boycotted long before Shayma's killing. And Al-Tayar al-Shabi is important because Al-Tayar al-Shabi was the backbone of Hamdeen al-Sabahi's presidential election campaign. They, along with the Dastoor party, along with other movements, called for political participation mid-2014, argued that political participation is important even if the political context and the freedoms context is not conducive for participation. But all of these changed their minds. And they found that participating in elections would be more damaging to them than participating, because as Reem has pointed, they are weak parties. They lack funding, they lack organizations, they worry about their members. The case everyone loves to quote or cite is in January 2014, when members of the Strong Egypt Party were campaigning for a no vote on the referendum, and and 10 members were arrested and charged under different charges. And they see that if we cannot campaign, if we have problems campaigning, if the main issue for us was, and this is what they tell me, if we wanted to engage in elections so that we can engage more with the electorate, and we're under a threat and there are no potential gains, then it is true what others have been saying, that this is only a facade, that it's just a formality so that their participation would only legitimize the elections. So what are we left with? We're left with different people on the different spectrum that are not interested in participating. We're left with people, the political parties, even though they're weak, but they can work on selling the elections to people, to getting people to engage in the process. They can sell an idea, they can sell a project, even how small it is, and get more stakeholders in the elections. But without this, without the state presenting or making what it has to do in terms of proving or at least facilitating a better environment for this, we will be stuck with a situation where the parliament, we can disagree about its importance in the political process, but the parliament as the formal representation of political participation is happening without with not only people not interested in it, but people that are challenging, actively challenging it. The alternatives, whether it's among the Islamists or among the non-Islamists, people understand or see that they don't have many alternatives. It's not like we will boycott and we'll create another alternative. It's very much a decision doused in desperation. But this is in itself a problem, because not only are we, does this mean that there are no stakeholders, that there are people just outside the process, but it's leaving, as we see, and I'll revisit this probably, hopefully in the questions, about the violence. We have a low-level insurgency. It's giving the state reason for more repression, but at the same time, the state is not taking any action. It's using it as an excuse for more repression, rather than including more and more sectors of the society in it and limiting the pool that adopts violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask one quick question before we open it up to questions. If we jump back to the question of the parties boycotting for a moment, what do you? Do you have an opinion on the efficacy of the boycott if one considers that it's impossible to tell an active boycott from ordinary common or garden variety apathy, unless political parties that have a known quantity say we are stepping down? And the other thing is, of course, it appears that many of the parties who have said that they're going to boycott are parties that were not expected to do that well on the elections in the first place. So how effective do you think their boycotts would be? And does it, would it, for example, rob any new legislative body of the kind of variety it would need?
Okay. As I said, the numbers are very difficult to find, or difficult to back up any speculation we have with numbers. But let's just compare 2000 and before the elections were cancelled, about over 7,000 people have been accepted as have applied for candidates in the elections. In 2011, that number was over 10,000. So we're seeing about 30% drop in people interested in the elections itself. would the lack of participation of some parties rob the parliament of legitimacy? It depends on how you define legitimacy and in whose eyes. It would definitely, other experiences in other parts of the world have demonstrated that the parliament can go on and it can complete its term, but it doesn't, it could lead to, it becomes a destabilizing factor. It doesn't, its stability, its sustainability of the process is in question because not enough people are not only believe in it, but are also taking part of it. And this is why, like, under Mubarak, we had elections. Some people called that, we go back to 2010 elections that happened months before the uprising, and see that was one of the reasons that led to the uprising because of the final straw. Or we can say it was irrelevant altogether. So it's really about how you define legitimacy. But for me, the key word here is sustainability of the political process in general.
Thank you. I actually said variety and not legitimacy, but it's also an important consideration. All right, thank you. So can we open up for questions now? And when you ask, just let us know who you are, please. And we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time and then come back to you. Please.
Hi. Me or? Oh, thank you. Oh, my name is Josh Lakin from the Department of State. Quick question for Professor Aziz. Some of the flaws that you pointed out with the election laws seem like they'd be obvious triggers for what ended up happening with the Supreme Court, right? So is it kind of your thought that it would signify just incompetence or maybe another aim with some of these flaws?
Thank you. My name is Samia Harris, and my question also is for Mrs. Aziz. And all the data and the facts that we follow up in Egypt tell us that the judicial system is neither fair nor unbiased. How can you actually trust any decision they come up with, and how can you develop a country that it does not have a fair and unbiased judicial system? When you have a politicized system, when you have one that runs with the power, when you have one that's anti the people, how can you actually get anything done that's with the aspiration of the people? How can you clean it up? Thank you.
Over there, please.
My name is Abdallah Hindawi. My question is to Ms. Sirgany. We talked about the boycotting, but I think this time the game is changing in a way that boycotting in 2010, before the January 25th revolution, boycotting wasn't really that effective because the regime of Mubarak didn't really care much about the participation. However, this time, the government of Sisi is actually very careful about including the different parties in the process of the elections. And the reason why I'm saying this is that because the government of Sisi had the burden to prove that we are not a coup government, we're not a military government, and here is everyone is participating. This first. Second is mainly about that the government need to have a parliament that endorse the investment laws that Sisi has been issuing over and over, and otherwise there would have been a real trouble for the government that having for one person to be issuing all the laws all the time. The third, and I think the most important one, is that during the 2010 parliament, there was one party who was interested in controlling the parliament. This time, we don't even have this one single party. So this means that if nobody participates, nobody will be in the parliament unless there's some other scattered fulul playing here and there, but without really having an effective tool to flavor the parliament with one certain sect.
Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, so let me try to answer the first one. So there is an attorney who was representing the government's position in defending the law before the Supreme Constitutional Court. And when he was asked, particularly this question is, why would you pass this if you were concerned that this would be unconstitutional, he responded that they went through the state's council department of legislations and fatwas. They went before the higher council of judges and the higher election committee in terms of vetting the law, and then it was ultimately approved by President Sisi. So the government's position is that we have made a good faith effort to attempt to vet this law through the respective quote-unquote experts, and we're not just kind of ramming it through. And so to the extent that we'll believe that those were meaningful reviews, now I will say that the State Council is known for being relatively independent compared to the ordinary judiciary. Until proven otherwise, I tend to look well upon the State Council as opposed to being a little bit more skeptical of the ordinary judiciary. But so I think it's a combination of two things. First, there is a lot of quote-unquote winging it going on right now because this is very new in terms of the possibility that in fact the law could be overturned. And there is also the issue of ex ante versus ex post review. The silver lining in this situation is that it's good that the SEC issued this ruling now, as opposed to after getting a parliament in place and repeating the 2012 debacle, which in my view undermined the legitimacy of the judiciary because it created the appearance that they were interfering in politics, and it created the appearance, whether it's real or not is a different question, that they were siding against the Brotherhood and sabotaging Morsi's prospective presidency. That's not to say that in fact that's what in fact happened, but that was the perception. So in many ways the process is a positive one or an improvement because things could be much worse. Having said that, there is no shortage of anecdotal conspiracy theories that the lawyers within the executive are very savvy at creating what you call kind of escape latches within laws where they know that this may not pass constitutional muster, but they proceed anyway as kind of a contingency plan if things don't turn out the way they want them to turn out from an elections results perspective. Of course, the problem with that narrative is it's hard to prove, and but it certainly isn't something that's completely unthinkable in the Egyptian political context. So I can't really answer it, but there are certain things that kind of one could think of. And just related to that is I have some empathy for the lawyers who are acting in good faith and trying to draft a new law, because Article 102, and I'll read it to you really quickly. You know, here's the provision that's at stake. The division of, other candidacy requirements, the electoral system, and division of electoral constituencies shall be defined by law in a manner which observes fair representation of the population and governorates and equitable representation of voters. Elections based on the plurality voting system or proportional list or a combination of both at whatsoever ratio may be adopted. That's very broad and very vague. What does fair representation mean? What does equitable representation mean? Well, it means whatever a court decides, a constitutional court decides it means. And we have the same challenge here in the United States and in any legal system where you have a constitutional court. So I wouldn't argue that this is automatic bad faith. The only thing that I thought stuck out is it's a huge disparity in the ratios. The 120 versus 420 to me screams out a major problem. And the fact that these party lists are already limited, and I can show you just give you this number. The quota goes as follows. You've got about 56 must be women, so among these 120. About 56 must be women, 24 Copts, 16 workers or farmers, 16 youth, 8 Egyptians abroad, and 8 disabled. And that pretty much fills up the entire 120. Now, if you're somebody who knows that the Egyptian system is predominated by men, wealthy men, and men from large families, well, most of the 420 are going to go to men, and they're going to go to older men, and they're going to go to Muslim men, and those who come from wealthy families. But the fact that the only way for the men to get in is through this individual candidacy, and the only way for the underrepresented is through this party list and kind of cramming it down the party list system, that I find to be problematic. With regard to the judiciary, it's a mixed bag. So I can't go into the details here. It's a separate talk. I have a paper called Theater of Transitional Justice, Reforming the Egyptian Judiciary, which you might want to read. The judiciary is not homogeneous. You're talking about 13,000 judges, sitting judges, and 16,000 judicial officials. That includes the prosecutors, and they're all members of the judiciary. And they are fighting among themselves. They have very significant disagreements among themselves of what judicial independence means. The state council has, the laws are much more protective of the state council's independence and restrictive of the executive's formal authorized interference with their affairs as opposed to the ordinary judiciary. Similarly, the Supreme Constitutional Court is kind of on its own. I'm sure you all saw the lawsuit where the judges, the ordinary judges, wanted to know the salaries of the Supreme Constitutional Court justices because they were concerned that they were getting paid more. So they're not all getting along. But I will note that Adli Mansour was the one who wrote one of these laws, and he recused himself, as he should have, from review. But I have heard anecdotes that he was very upset that this law got struck down because he viewed it as his baby. The other law was approved by President Aziz. So the judiciary is absolutely not fully independent, but it's a much more of a mixed bag than you kind of related. It's more problematic.
About your question. Yes, the parties I talk to are, or the people that I talk to are currently on the margin. They might have been center stage before, but they're currently on the margin, whether by their own choice or by the circumstances around them. If we're gonna say that the state wants a parliament and this is it, just a formality, then anyone would do. It doesn't have to be specific parties or political parties. Even on the secular and leftist side, you have the Egyptian Social Democrats were participating despite that their other colleagues or other alliances were not participating. We have Wafd still participating, Tagammu. You have other new parties that are on the state side, despite some disagreements within this camp, that are also participating and have very considerable network and infrastructure. So there will be people in the parliament. It's as Mirette has asked, it's the variety, the voices. They have the few Egyptians also participating. So you have a number of parties that have been tested in elections before, and some that are not totally, that are untested, whether they are, you would classify them as opposition or as pro-state. The situation, if you want to compare to 2010, I find we have changed. Like everyone could say that we're regressing to the Mubarak days. It's not the Mubarak days. It's 2011 still happened. Everything that changes, whether it's more repression, whether it's more political activity, it has happened because things before it has happened. You cannot undo things. You can try to change the outcome. You can try to change the future, but things have happened. There are people that are more interested in politics, in discussing politics. Regardless of how they translate this interest into participation or not, but politics has become an important issue on Egyptians' agenda. And you can see it online, you can see it if you walk around in Egypt. So tell me, about the scattered fulul, it's also not, we have parties that you can say have the fulul in them, they have the network of it. It's fulul is like to say the remnants of an old regime, but they also, it's not exactly the same people that you saw in 2010 and you saw in the Mubarak days. It could be people from the same family, from the same tribe, from the same village or from the same town that represent the same interest within the new constituencies, and there are good networks out there, but then again, many of them, these new networks, the new formulated networks, are untested. We haven't seen them perform in elections yet. So the outcome is very, very much out there. We can say it's gonna, the NDP, old NDP, are gonna win. But again, what do we have to prove that? Nothing.
If I can ask Reem to follow up on something, because this may cut into your question and to Sarah's. You mentioned the Future Egypt Party, which you said might be big, not in the manner of the NDP, but in the manner of state support. Can you go into a little more detail, because I think it relates directly to what Sarah was saying?
Sure. I just want to repair to one point that complements what Sarah just mentioned, which is the boycotting movement during the presidential elections. In fact, what happened during the presidential election in 2014 was that people boycotted elections. Different political forces decided to not get involved with the presidential race, and they didn't favor either Hamdin Sabahi or Sisi as a candidate. But again, was that effective? That's a big question mark. After all, the whole propaganda worked in convincing people that boycotting is not the suitable strategy at the moment. So I'll talk now about the Future of Egypt party. That's a movement that started to develop before the deadline for submitting the candidacy to the higher commission on elections, and it started from youth that supported the current president, and they were spreading all over the different universities and all over the country. Actually, it's a national movement, and then they were hijacked by the candidates from في حب مصر party list. في حب مصر party list was headed by basically the state supporters candidates. The structure of the party is not yet disclosed. It's not announced. They only announced that that's a youth party supporting the current government, and they are supporting the state in a generic form. But they seem to have a wide network relying on the Fulul network, the ex-regime's political actors, and young members that's rising after what happened, the whole movement during the 4 years ago. So that's it. We don't have the structure. We only know that the network decided to file for a new party called Future of Egypt.
Okay, yes.
Yes. Wanted to note.
Thank you.
Even though there is reason to suspect there's the NDP and the remnants of the NDP, most of the literature on the NDP concludes that it was actually a very depoliticized party, meaning that it wasn't ideologically cohesive, where you had a group of people who agreed on a particular ideology or rallied around a certain individual that they were personally loyal to undyingly. They would have sold Mubarak down the river in a minute. And they would have left the NDP if there was a better deal in town. It was very much based on material self-interest of particular families and clans, and the NDP was ingenious at selecting individuals within each region or governorate or district that were very well known and that were respected within the cultural community of that, whether it's North Egypt, the Delta, the Southern Egypt, and picking those people and making a deal with them and allowing them to use a political position in the parliament for self-dealing and unjust enrichment, and essentially siphoning off the resources of the state for usually their own personal enrichment or their business, which then would help presumably their family because it's a highly kinship-based social structure. So I expect that's what Sisi is doing as we speak. Is he's trying to figure out how can I recreate that without creating the impression to the Egyptians that I'm finding a new NDP, because that will be met with a visceral rejection. So the NDP and the Muslim Brotherhood are probably two of the most unpopular names right now in Egyptian politics for various different reasons. So that's the game he's going to play. It's not going to be an ideologically based sense of loyalty, which, by the way, makes him a much more fragile president than some people may think. He's very strong in terms of having a monopoly over the use of force and having influence over the military and one would argue maybe the police, although that's still unclear. But from a political sense, from a political loyalty sense, I think he's quite vulnerable.
Thank you. All right. Questions? Please.
Claire Ashcraft from NDI. I'm almost here. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm Claire Ashcraft from NDI, and my question's for either Reem or Sarah. What can political parties do to rebuild some of the lost trust you've spoken about, and particularly involve youth?
Thank you. Can you both answer that? Can we start with Reem?
Okay, so we're talking about the lost trust, which is something related to the old heritage of political parties in Egypt. That's something that political parties can't change overnight at all. It takes time. It takes time and effort. I just want to talk about basically that's not the main challenge facing political parties at the moment. They are under heavy attack of the closed political atmosphere at the moment. So they don't have an access to outreach to people and gain their trust. And I think that with the high polarized environment that we're living in, the only way for political parties to approach people, not even to touch their trust, not to gain their support at all, but to outreach to people, is to adopt a centralized conservative discourse that is based on sociological approach and it's not politicized at all, because people are getting really defensive whenever there is a heavy political debate going on. I honestly think that would somehow loosen the tension in the society from political parties, because the polls show that there is a high level of distrust that Egyptians carry against political parties as political institutions. They would rather support the army, the police force first, the parliament, and then the political parties. So they have a really long way to go. Youth membership. Actually, the political parties in Egypt are facing a huge struggle getting membership, let alone youth membership. The problem with the youth is that they have been going through waves of this popular discontent, as I mentioned. They want informal activism. They want the formal institutions of political parties to institutionalize informal approaches in their institutions. So the political parties has to accommodate the needs of the young members. They have to be more up to speed. They have to act fast. They have to cater for their interests. And unfortunately, the interest of the young members now does not suit the closed political environment. So it's a really tough predicament that the political parties are facing. It's not that easy. It's really complex. And I think with a light discourse, a more social discourse approaching young members could gather them. And also another solution would be just to outreach to NGOs and other civil society organizations that includes young members, and then work with them informally until the young members get involved in political parties. So networking, decentralization would be an answer for political parties.
If I may add to this, there was an article last year written by a young analyst called Bilal Ali, and it was called "Exiting the Square." And in it, he basically said the revolution has failed when people stopped coming up with solutions, even theoretical solutions. And this is what the parties also believe that they have. They haven't created a project to rally supporters around them yet. A project that would create an alternative in terms of social and economic solutions to the problems Egypt's facing. So they're not saying just criticizing the projects that the state comes up with, but they're also creating alternatives. They're saying this is the other path. You can see some parties are doing this, are doing things close to this, but it's not a fully blown project that can be you can look at it and scrutinize it, but also simplify it and sell it to the people. But again, I agree with the predicament they're in. Even pro-state parties or pro-state voices have been criticizing the environment in which they're operating. They're saying everyone calls us weak, and yes, we're weak. Everyone is just criticizing the political parties, and sometimes rightfully so, but it's also creating an environment where it's the state, it's the people, and everyone just thinks that the fact that the party is seeking to win in elections is being opportunist. And well, they need to win in elections. They need to sell their ideology. They need to promote it. So there are a lot of things that have to change within the context and the circumstances. The parties have to do a lot. They still have to build their base. They have to find this weird, as Reem said, this weird or difficult challenge of catering to young base, and also adapting this to to formalize political participation. And at the same time, it's selling it to the public, is telling them telling people that we will fight for your interest, and this is how we're going to do it. And if you stand by us, these are our principles, which include also democratization, equality, and whatever the list has for this political party, whether conservative or liberal, and be able to sell it to people as a package and get these people to rally behind them, so that eventually we have stakeholders in the political participation, away from to have a political base, not just people interested in politics.
Thank you. Any other questions? Sam, please.
Thank you. Samuel Tadros from the Hudson Institute. My question is regarding actually not Parliament, but whether there's been any talk in Egypt about municipal elections at all. 2008 was the last time we had those elections, and they've been disbanded by a court order in 2011. So is anyone talking at all about the need for having municipal councils, any form of representative government at all? Thank you.
Also answer it. Municipal elections are always on the background. You talk when I talk to political parties that didn't have high expectations for the parliament, they said at least it will be training for our members when they run in municipal elections. This is their true core. This is the base, the nucleus of political participation that they want to build. It involves direct engagement with the society. It involves building young leadership that would grow into members of parliament eventually, and would direct engagement with the voters in terms of the party's political ideology. So it's the line between providing services and also selling ideology. The problem is, on the government side, I haven't been hearing anything about municipal elections. Maybe I'm not hearing it, and they're saying it, but it's not out there. There was some sort of unwritten agreement in 2011 when the municipal councils were dissolved, that these elections will come after parliamentary elections, but they're not even on the roadmap that was announced in 2013. There was an initiative in 2011, 2012 called Mahalliyat. Mahalliyat is the Arabic word for municipals. And its founder now has just stopped working on it. And they were trying to build up support for it. They're trying to get numbers about what is a municipal council, what does it do, how can you as a citizen benefit from it and get involved with the government. But since we don't even know when the parliamentary elections are going to happen, and then when the municipal councils, if they're going, municipal council elections would happen, when would that be? No one is talking about any schedule for that. So I don't know. And Reem maybe can elaborate on that.
Reem?
No, I don't think there is more elaboration on that. It's true that the parties are currently working on training programs for their members on how to be local leaders, and that's basically one of the most successful exercises that political parties are involved in at the moment. Many parties such as Strong Egypt, Free Egyptians, and even the Social Democrats are now working on the curriculum of trainings for their members on the local level, and that's a decentralized nationwide training. But from the side of the government, I don't think they are talking about it at all. Although I know for a fact that it was mentioned during the president's meeting with the political parties' leaders during the second day, which involved the second ranked political parties, the lowest supported political parties. And there was a question from the Egypt Freedom Party, headed by Shahir George, on the matter. And basically, President Sisi decided to ignore it first, and then when the question was asked more, he answered that that's not off the table at the moment, but that's a good exercise for political parties, and we'll consider it later after the parliamentary elections. But on official record, there is no talking about it at all.
I just want to make one comment, is for municipal elections to be relevant, first you need to decentralize Egypt's political process. It's very centralized, as we all know, not only at the national level, but in Cairo and vis-a-vis the rest of the country. So there's two issues that I would want to kind of gather more information about in order to answer that question. The first is the jurisdictional issues, is to what extent will a municipal government in fact have jurisdiction over important decisions, or will it ultimately have to always defer to the federal or central parliamentary representative who will just tell them, do this, do this, do this. Because if they don't have their own jurisdiction, then those elections will not be important and those people will not matter. And then you just have all the other side effects from that and the consequences. And then the other issue is to what extent that they're going to be not influenced. They may have their own jurisdiction, but to what extent will they be unduly influenced by other actors, such as whoever's holding the parliament? When you've got this hierarchical system or this kinship-based social structure, can you realistically run for a municipal office if you are not from a well-connected family, if you are not the male patriarch, if you are not from a wealthy family? The same impediments might exist there as they would at the national level. So I would look at those issues as well, as opposed to just kind of blindly accepting that municipal elections may be a panacea for engaging the youth in formal politics. But I haven't heard anything either. It's been completely a silent issue.
Thank you. To get that done that you had just talked about, don't you think we have to have governors elected? I mean, to get governors appointed just defeats all the purposes. So don't you think you should have included it in the new constitutions, that every governorate should have their own right to elect their governor? Thank you.
I'll just tell my opinion. For whom? Others can weigh in. So I think that one thing we have to be careful about from the American perspective is we have the wonderful concept of federalism that both unites and divides this country in more ways than one. And not all countries, that's the part of their legal history. So it's a very centralized system. So appointing governorates perpetuates that centralization. The other reason why I think there's two reasons why I don't think they'll ever be elected, political reasons, although I do agree they should be, is it is a very, very valuable bargaining tool for the presidency. To be the governor and be appointed the governor is a coveted position, and so that can be used in order to, again, get loyalty, political horse trading. The second is kind of related to that, and I don't know if this is true, but I've heard anecdotes, I'd be interested to hear from Sarah and Reem, is there has been some concerns that since Sisi's come into power, that many of the governors that have been appointed have some ties to the military or police apparatus, which then feeds into not just the centralization of power, but the securitization of power, where the security apparatus continues to have strong influence within governance. And so that's also something to be thinking about. But I mean, I personally, but I'm biased as being as an American lawyer, American trained lawyer, is I do think that having an elected governor is better for local representation. But I just accept that I have that bias.
Before we pass that over, we should just point out that, consistently speaking, all of Egypt's appointed, of all of Egypt's appointed governors, at least 50% have come from the military and the security. All the time, all the time. So, no, yes, exactly. So there's it's not 23 out of 27, I don't think. No, it's not. But anyway, we can look it up later. Do we have any final questions before we wrap up, please? Ali.
Ali Mohammed, a student and an intern at the Atlantic Council here. I have a comment and a question. My comment is regarding why the political parties are weak. I think, as an Egyptian, one reason is the state and security intervention. And we have a lot of examples. The state intervention caused some parties, around like 10 parties, to boycott the elections. And also, the Al-Wafd party leader, Sayyid Al-Sayyid al-Badawi, he threatened to withdraw from the election in February. And a third example about the state intervention was mentioned in Abu Ghar article in Al-Masri Al-Yawm as well. And my question is addressed to Professor Aziz. You know that President Sisi in June 2014, he issued a decree establishing what's called the Legislative Reform Committee. It is a body that's entrusted with much power, much legislative power, and it's appointed by Sisi himself. And as a result, Sisi has issued around 200 decrees and amendments. And according to the Article 156 of the Constitution, the Parliament has to review these decrees and amendments in 15 days after commencing sessions. So do you think the Sisi regime is serious about the election, about the holding the election in the first place in the presence of the Legislative Reform Committee, which is entrusted with preparing and researching the decrees and laws issued by the President or the Prime President? Thank you so much.
Well, I think that President Sisi, like any political actor, has one priority, which is to stay in power. I don't think that's a sin necessarily. That's the game of politics. The question is, is there a system in place that allows for opposition to remove someone from power through elections? And that's what we're still trying to figure out in Egypt. And that's, I think, the million-dollar question. People are going to think this is controversial, but and we'll find out if I'm wrong. But I do have a prediction, and again, I may be completely wrong, but I predict that there will be some amendments to the Constitution forthcoming. And one of them may be this, if not only justified by practical reasons, because it's either going to be a complete rubber stamp process. So it's not meaningful at all. It's just, yes, approve, approve, approve. Or it cannot happen if it's meaningful, because those are a lot of decrees. The very reason why we need these elections is so that Egypt is not put in a position, Egyptians and the president is not, whoever he is not put in a position where he is both the executive and the legislative branch, which undermines the legitimacy of the law and undermines the legitimacy of the executive branch and creates problems for the judiciary, because then they're stuck in this very strange situation where they're supposed to pretend as if there's a legislature when in fact it's the same person that's the executive. And that's also unfair to the judges. So they get politicized whether they like it or not. So I think he's balancing, like any political actor, well, is it to my benefit to get this legislature so that I can have legitimacy in whatever laws are passed, or at least I can claim they're not mine, somebody else passed them, this parliament that you elected, or is it to my benefit to continue to have control over the legislative process that would facilitate perpetuating the executive agenda which includes economic development, presumably counterterrorism, all kinds. I mean, he has a political agenda like any executive. And I think he's weighing those two. And there's a lot of speculation as to whether Sisi was happy or not about the SEC's ruling. And I think to the extent that this ruling has not affected his economic development plans and his solicitation of economic investment abroad, so to the extent it has not affected that, then I think this is actually good for Sisi because it gives him more time to implement his executive agenda. And any executive, including President Obama or whoever was our former president, the dream come true is to not have a parliament that gets in your way, because you're there with you have an executive mission. So I think that's not unique to him, but I think it's up to the people to push for it, and I think he needs to be careful, and his loyalists need to be careful. If they overplay that hand for too long, it's going to be very difficult for him to claim he's not a dictator.
All right. I'd just like to thank everyone for coming, to thank our panelists, especially the poor lady who's had to hang around on Skype for 2 hours. So thank you all for coming. If you have any questions for the panelists, or rather for Mrs. Sirgany, because I know that Professor Aziz actually has to jump on a plane. So thank you all for coming. All right.